everybody. Welcome to What to Read, the Books podcast. So, I was just going through my phone just thinking, we started off this whole year, which is now being called the lost year, the year 2020. It's been a very dark year. We started off with impeachment, of course, the impeachment of Donald J. Trump. Then we moved into the pandemic. Then we moved into the pandemic lockdown. Then we moved into the protests over people being told to wear masks and being told to, be safe basically from the lockdown. We had people protesting because they didn't like the idea of having their liberty infringed in order to keep them alive. Now we've moved into this point where you have states slowly starting to reopen. And now here we are again, where the conversation that we're having is about violence. It's about black bodies being killed, being misused, being abused. The abuse, the sort of chronic abuse of black bodies, which is a core part of American history, is back in the center of conversation. The George Floyd case, the latest, and let's just isolate just the three most recent clients of attorney Ben Crump. George Floyd, who was in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was pulled over by police. At some point, he wound up on the ground, face down, with an officer's knee basically on his neck for about 9 minutes. He is eventually taken away on a stretcher while bystanders actually watch this happen and are yelling, "You're killing him, let him up, you're killing him," while a second officer just stares at them and at one point has his hand over his mace, as they're screaming, "You're killing this guy." He eventually dies in the hospital. So that's one. And then you go back to Brianna Taylor, who's a young EMT, who's killed in her own home. Very similar to the Tatiana Jefferson case, where police burst into the home at 1 o'clock in the morning. They shoot and kill her. They arrest her boyfriend and claim that he was violent toward the police. They eventually have dropped the charges, but they were going to charge him after they killed her. The George Floyd case, you just go back a second, he literally says, "I can't breathe," like Eric Garner. It's almost the same. He's saying, "I can't breathe, I'm gonna die here." It's very much like the Eric Garner case. So all these cases seem to have, an associated case that's very similar. Then you have the Ahmaud Arbery case, which looked like a game hunt, to be honest with you. These are two trucks full of white armed men, one of whom is a former police officer, who follow this guy who they claim they believed was a robbing a house. His family says he was just out jogging. He may have checked out a home that was under construction because he was interested in being an electrician and looking at the wiring. And he's jogging along. He gets pursued. You see on video because one of the people in the cars actually tapes it, who's now been arrested. And he's killed. The Ahmaud Arbery case, which is very much like the Trayvon Martin case. Someone is pursuing you and they kill you. And then they say, well, I feared for my life, so I killed the person. We also had the Cooper's case. We had Christian Cooper, who is a birder in Central Park in New York City, liberal New York City. He comes across a woman named Amy Cooper, both the name Cooper, and she is walking her dog off leash, which she's not allowed to do. It's a part of the park where important species are, species of plants, species of birds. It's destructive to these species for dogs to be walking off leash. So he says to her, "Hey, you can't have your dog off leash. You need to put your dog on leash." She responds to it by demanding that he stop filming the encounter with her, and then she threatens to call the police and tell them straight up, "There is an African American threatening me and my dog." And then she does she calls the police and does this fake crying thing where, "I'm so scared," literally fakes it. It's a very sort of Emmett Till situation where she's just making up a lie about this man. She's now been fired. On and on and on. Multiple cases. There's another one in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where a guy decides that these young black men who are entrepreneurs in the same WeWork building as him shouldn't be there. They need to show him their papers. They don't do it. And so he's like, "I'm going to call the police on you." This is it's an epidemic that doesn't seem to be able to go away. And I was on with my friend Chris Hayes the other night, and it was just, it's racking your brain at a certain point because it's so depressing and distressing and degrading and demoralizing as a black person, as a black parent, as a black wife, as a black sibling, As somebody who's living in black skin, to think every minute of every day you are under threat of death, not just from the police, but from any civilian who just decides that you're a threat to them, and for some reason, that there is this sort of assumption among so many white Americans that they have authority over you just because you're black, that they have authority, that they can ask who you are, that they can ask for your ID, that they can sort of treat you almost like it's South Africa in 1960 as opposed to the United States in 2020. My guest that I have today on What to Read, that we're going to be interviewing, spoke so eloquently to this on CNN on the morning show. And let me just play a little bit of that. Let me play a little of what he said.
Ella Baker said, "Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons become as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens." She said that in 1964, and we're still echoing those same cries today. It was hard to listen to that interview. It's just so much pain. You get so tired. We have black children. I have a 15-year-old daughter. I mean, what do I tell her? I'm raising a son. I have no idea what to tell him.
So that is Bakari Sellers. I have given away the tease here. He's going to be our guest on What to Read. But, you know, when you think about what brings someone like Bakari to tears, somebody who has such a long history as a legislator, he's a TV commentator, a political commentator. He's a tough guy. He's got, 2 young children and a 14-year-old. He's a parent. The thing that brings you to tears, and the thing that is so depressing, and the reason that everyone I know is down right now, the reason that people are marching in Minneapolis, that people are crying out and protesting in ways that, to the Tucker Carlsons of the world, to them it just looks like looting and mayhem. But this is the outcry of a stressed, depressed, angry, frustrated people who have been in this country for 400 some odd years, and still all these centuries later cannot get the decent modicum of respect to be treated as a human being and not as cattle and not as an animal. And I was on with Chris Hayes the other night and talked about this idea of whether or not we are even viewed as citizens in this country. And what I talked about is the idea that, when this country was formed, it was formed by Europeans who were trying to get away from the king. The idea was, we don't want to be under the king. So we European men are going to come across here with some of our women, and we're going to form our own country. At first they were just a colony, but they were a colony away. So they're away from the king. So they had liberty from the king. They weren't under his auspices. Then they got uncomfortable with the fact that the king still wanted to tax them and still wanted authority over them. So we're out of here. We're done. We don't want to even be in your country anymore. Goodbye, King of England, King George. We're out. Form our own country, write our own constitution in which we write in for ourselves these natural laws, like these natural rights that we've got, these natural rights. We have the rights to all of these liberties, but the liberties really were only for them, for white men, because the indigenous people they came across, they didn't think they had any rights. The Africans they enslaved and imported over here like cattle. They didn't believe they had any rights. They didn't even think their wives had any rights. No one had any rights except them. They were citizens. They were citizens of this new frontier of freedom for white men. And everybody else, everybody that even after enslavement was over, the Chinese that they brought in to build the railroads, well, they weren't really fully citizens. They were just there to work. The Japanese who came in and were just workers, and then when they became inconvenient because they were the same ethnicity as the people we were at war with during World War II, well, we had to lock them up because they're a threat. The Mexicans who they encountered in what was Mexico, and then once they took it over and they took over places like Texas that were Mexico, Colorado, California, all these places that were part of either the Spanish Empire or part of Mexico, they were like, well, you aren't really citizens. You don't belong here. As a matter of fact, we will try to deport as many of you as possible, even though most of you were born here, but it doesn't matter. You're not really citizens. This idea that citizenship is a thing white people own in America, that citizenship is a thing that only white people have fully in America. Everyone else is sort of their subject. and is treated like a subject. And the idea that black people who basically started out with the country, 1619, we arrive here enslaved as well as indigenous people. We were enslaved too, and we come with the origin of the country. We predate the United States being a country, but even to this day, we still aren't treated as full citizens with full human rights. The police treat us just differently. There's video of this young man, 21-year-old, who apparently runs a stop sign, blows through a stop sign or a stoplight. The police in this Texas town draw down on his house. 2 cars of police point guns at him. He's terrified. He drops on his belly, screaming, I'm scared. Are you going to shoot me? Please don't shoot me. His family comes pouring out of the house. Please don't shoot him. Please don't shoot him. The police keep their guns trained on him for at least 3 minutes. This kid is terrified. He, at one point, is crying. And then his 90-year-old grandmother comes out of the house to try to protect her grandchild. And the police draw down on the grandma and shove her, and she falls on the ground. She's 90. So there's not even a respect for a senior citizen woman. There's no sense that, let's be careful. Let's be gentle with this 90-year-old woman. She's just cattle, and the idea that, and that's in Texas. The murder situation takes place in New York. The murder of George Floyd is in Minnesota. It's all over the country. It's in the red parts. It's in the blue parts. It's in the liberal parts. It's in the conservative parts. It's in the South. It's everywhere. And it's not just one group of people. It's almost everyone all the time. And it's literally the most demoralizing, depressing, de-energizing thing that's happening in the country today. Jason, did you have a comment?
I'm trying to keep my powder dry. I'm just listening. If I say anything, it's going to be banned.
Yeah, I mean the reality is that it's just very difficult, because it isn't even just black men who are, of course, at the top of the list of they who need to be controlled, they who must be controlled. If they march, well, that's an automatic threat to the public safety, so they need to have the tanks rolled out. I saw that in Baltimore. I've never seen a tank before, and I grew up in Colorado, which had military bases. The first time I ever saw a tank was in Baltimore in 2015, when I was covering the uprising over Freddie Gray. And this was a guy who was also literally slammed like a wet noodle after bike patrol pulled him over for some minor infraction. He ends up dead, flung in the back of a car like he's nothing, like he's a cow, like he's a piece of cattle, like he's nothing. And killed, and then uprising happens there. And then this idea of referring to the uprisings as riots, as if these black people just have nothing better to do than to just riot and loot, and they just don't have any respect for the people. No, this is the absolute utter frustration. It was Dr. King who said a riot is the language of the unheard. It is a scream of desperation. And it is not even just black men who are, again, he who must be controlled. It's black women. Brianna Taylor was an EMT. Like, she was saving people from COVID. Like, her job was to actually save lives from COVID in the midst of a pandemic. She ends up shot in her house, Fred Hampton style. What the hell is going on in this country right now? And so this is like the perfect interview for the fact that this is what's in my head right now, to talk to Bakari Sellers, because you'll hear his family history really is relevant to this. He has a book out that I think is really relevant to talking about American history, to talking about this mess that we're in. And at some point, we as a country have got to solve this question of subjects versus citizens, because black people have earned in every way the right of full citizenship. We built this country, literally, we built the White House. Like, you wouldn't even have a White House if we hadn't built it. I mean, we were forced to build it. It's not like we chose to build it, but the enslaved black people built the White House. You wouldn't even have a White House without black people, and Minnesota, the mistreatment of indigenous people. Minnesota is an indigenous word. You wouldn't even have the name Minnesota if it weren't for indigenous people. You wouldn't have the name California and the name Colorado if it weren't for Mexico. Mexicans. These are in the Mexican language, you know. Half the food we eat in this country comes from some other country. You know, the idea that white Europeans are the be-all and end-all of American citizenship is ridiculous. Everyone has a full right to citizenship just by virtue of being here and being a part of, you know, making the country function. And right now, the biggest irony of this whole pandemic nightmare is that the people who are out there screaming and protesting with long guns and screaming spittle into the faces of police officers, they're not protesting because they want to go work, as Jess McIntosh so eloquently said. They're not protesting because they want to go work in a slaughterhouse and be in a meat packing facility. They're protesting because they want you to go work. They want some black and brown or immigrant person to go work there because they want their steak, damn it. They want their hair done. They want their stuff. They want what they want, and they want it now. And you better get your behind right back into that slaughterhouse and make me my steak. That's what this is. This is people who see themselves as in a superior level of citizenship to other people, demanding that the people they believe they are better than get back out there and get me my I'm not gonna cuss. So it is actually a really scary time when we are in such retrograde. I feel like it's not even Donald Trump in this era, he's not even taking us back to the 1950s. He's taking us back to the 1920s. He's taking us back to the 1920s, complete with the pandemic, which first happened in 1918. He's literally taking us back to the Spanish flu era. Socially, in terms of the discohesion of our society, in terms of the racial attitudes, in terms of the apartheid nature of the culture, and the sort of the virulence of what he's brought to the table, the way that he encourages his supporters to act, it's really unbelievable. But we're not going to get into a whole political discussion. Let's bring in our guest. And joining me now is one of the most impressive brothers that you're going to see on television. He's a CNN commentator. And in 2006, at just 22 years old, he made history in the state of South Carolina, defeating a 26-year incumbent state representative to become the youngest member of the South Carolina state legislature, the youngest African-American elected official in the country. In 2014, he was the Democratic nominee for lieutenant governor in the state of South Carolina. I could go through a whole bunch of stuff. He's been on the 40 under 40 list. I could go on and on and on, but I'm just going to let him go on about himself. Right now, he is sporting the Marvin Gaye look, which is pretty amazing. Bakari Sellers, my friend, how are you?
I'm doing quite well. As we're going through this time of Corona and with all of the tragedy we see around us, I'm doing well, and I'm blessed and fortunate, and want to say thank you for allowing me to come and talk about my Vanishing Country on your platform. It's truly an honor to have friends like you, and I'm just grateful and thankful.
Well, I appreciate that. And My Vanishing Country is the book, and it's coming. It came out in May, and it's coming out at a really, I would say, an auspicious time in the country. You have been one of the most eloquent voices talking about the murder of George Floyd, which we know happened in Minneapolis. And Bakari, you've spoken so eloquently to it, as a parent, just as a human being. This is the thing about it for me, is how many of these deaths there have been just in such a short period of time. George Floyd's death mirrors Eric Garner's death. Brianna Taylor, the EMT who was shot down in her own home, mirrors a Tatiana Jefferson's death. Ahmaud Arbery, his death mirrors Trayvon Martin's death. You could go on and on and on and on. As a young black man, as a young black parent, can you contextualize all this for us before we jump into the book?
Yeah, I think I can. This is not new in this country. Being black is being in a perpetual state of grief, and the terror and trauma that people of color, black folk, have to live with is something that goes back. I look at things, when you ask me to contextualize it, I look at things through the lens of being a son of the civil rights movement. And I remember my father getting involved in the movement after seeing the picture of Emmett Till in 1955. And so when you think about Emmett Till, or you think about Medgar Evers or Jimmy Lee Jackson, the 4 little girls in the 16th Street Baptist Church, you fast forward to Trayvon, you fast forward to my friend Clem, who was murdered in Mother Emanuel AME Church with 8 others. This perpetual sense of grief, this perpetual trauma, this lack of humanity that Black bodies are treated with in this country is not new. The question is, I asked this question in the book, and I think it answers your question directly. How many of us have to die before somebody truly cares?
Yeah, and one wonders because, during the Barack Obama era, Black Lives Matter came to the fore. There was this quote unquote national conversation on race, which I think is always a little bit of BS because the only people who really want to have the conversation are Black people, and white Americans are like, we'll have a little of it, but mostly we don't want to. And that went nowhere, and we still see the killings. And then in this era, particularly coming from South Carolina, how is it different now with this president than that conversation looked under President Obama?
Well, I one of my criticisms in my Vanishing Country was I called Barack Obama tepid when it came to issues of race, particularly Black Lives Matter, and I believe that to be true. Under this president, though, it's unique. He's added the proverbial gasoline to the fire. I go back to Charlottesville, and I remind people about Charlottesville. For me, the most damning part of Charlottesville, the thing that had me awestruck, is that these racist white boys didn't wear hoods. They didn't wear masks. They didn't cover their face. And although we've had racism in this country long before Donald Trump, unfortunately, we'll have it after Donald Trump. The unique thing about Donald Trump is he has emboldened people to take their hoods off. And now we're able to see, because these people who were chanting nigger, who were chanting Jews do not replace us, they were, loan officers. They were in the public school system. They were medical professionals. They were in the fabric of these systems of injustice that we've been screaming about for a long period of time. And finally, they came out of the woodworks and they didn't even wear their hoods.
You write in the book about, you mentioned your dad who got to know Stokely Carmichael, who was part of SNCC, I guess came across Dr. King as well. Talk about what your father's history, what was the impact on you? When were you old enough to really understand that history and for it to impact you?
Well, you have to be very cautious about summoning Stokely in my house because I have named my son, one of my twins, Stokely, after Stokely Carmichael. So he may come running around the corner with his hands up.
And he's welcome on the podcast, by the way. If he does that, he will get an A+ for that behavior.
I love it. He loves the camera like his daddy. My father was involved in SNCC. My father went to Howard University, and he was convinced by Stokely after Stokely graduated to drop out of Howard. And he joined SNCC. My father went to Philadelphia, Mississippi to look for the bodies of Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney. February 8th, 1968. It's amazing how many shared stories we have, Troy, but my father was shot in the Orangeburg Massacre. He was shot by law enforcement. 3 people were killed: Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton. I think that's the pain that it invokes in my spirit. I mean, here we are, over 50 years since that incident, 52 years since that incident, and my father and I are still having many of the same shared experiences. That's a trauma. My sister's middle name is Abademe. It's Swahili. It means born while father's away, because my father was not only shot, he was not only put on death row when his bond was denied, but my father was in prison. All the officers who fired shots into the group of students were found not guilty. My father was charged, tried, and convicted of rioting, becoming the first and only one-man riot in the history of this country. And that injustice, it left mothers without their sons, and it left the pages of my state's history stained red with blood. And it forced my mother to give birth to their oldest child, my big sister, while my dad was in prison. And, I lived my life for Henry Smith and Samuel Hammond and Delano Middleton. I lived my life for Emmett Till. And as soon as you close your wallet up and you think you can stop putting pictures of those who you live your life for, it seems like you get another picture to put in there. And so now I'm adding George, I'm adding Brianna, and I'm adding Ahmad. There's people that didn't get a chance to get married, didn't get a chance to graduate, and I have to live for them. And I write about that trauma, I write about that pain, along with the ups of being, a young legislator in South Carolina, the downs of living through that and living through the Charleston massacre. And I'm only 35 years old. And so carrying that grief, it pushes me to push this country to be a more perfect union.
Yeah, and and the thing about it is, at your young age, to have to have all of that history already, sewn up in you and in your spirit. I think about, I don't know if you've seen this video of this young boy. He can't be like more than 14, 15, singing about wanting to live and wanting to survive with this beautiful, voice. He's obviously very, very young. When that video broke me yesterday, I was like, that was it. I was already traumatized. But the fact is that young Black Americans are growing up with so much trauma, and you used exactly the right word. Yet when you wrote down your history, even at your age, you wrote a memoir. You called it My Vanishing Country. I think for a lot of Americans, Black Americans, it's hard to grasp this as my country because it feels constantly like we are treated as invaders or intruders. You know what I mean? Like when you were thinking about the title, what were you thinking about?
I was thinking about growing up in the dirt roads of South Carolina. I was thinking about growing up in the Black Belt, not Black Belt for people, but as you know, I have to explain this to others, but as you know, it's the Black Belt because of the richness of the soil that grows the sugarcane and the cotton, the soybeans, etc. And I was thinking about the great people, the good people whose voices I wanted to lift up, the church ladies who wear the big hats, sit in the second row, who put 2 sticks of butter in their pies, and when you hug them, you smell like them the rest of the morning.
Yes. Yes.
Or the old men who sit in the barbershop who ain't there to get a haircut. They just there to tell stories about when they saw Sonny Liston box back in the day. I wanted to lift up their voices. But that country, that place that I once knew, is disappearing for us. That those cities of economic upward mobility in the South are now, like I talk about Denmark so eloquently in my book, are now places where you have food deserts, where you don't have access to quality care, where you're drinking dirty water, you're inhaling pollutants. You go to schools where your heating and air don't work, where your infrastructure is falling apart. And so, yes, our communities are vanishing before our eyes. I refer to the South as the center of Black cultural liberation. And that's vanishing before our eyes. And so you look at that and you overlay that with the pandemic now. And you know the saying better than most. When America catches a cold, Black folk get pneumonia, right? And we're at that point now. But on a macro level, I have a 14-year-old daughter who gets her license, her permit on June 1st. She turns 15. And I have 16-month-old twins. And this country's promises to them, not just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but love, truth, justice, and peace. I don't think anyone who's living in this environment today can not say that those promises are vanishing. And so that's how I came up with the title of My Vanishing Country. Maybe it's aspirational, and maybe I'm still, displaying my youthful naivete, but I want to have hope and I want to have faith.
Yeah. South Carolina is a very particularly interesting state. The Denmark VC part of it, that it was the place where the what happened in Haiti, that's where people feared it would happen in America, right? It was the landing point for so many enslaved people. It was the trading point for Black lives and Black bodies. And it was the place where there was a particular fear of Black people that sparked so much violence. What made you in your 20s decide this is a place I can be a state legislator?
Oh, for me, let me just tell you, Joy, I think you know me well enough to know that sometimes I do display my millennial attributes. And I was first of all, I felt like I could change the world. And my parents, growing up with Stokely and Julian, particularly Julian, I always tell people, and I talk about this in the book, I'd much rather be considered Julian Bond than Barack Obama. And that's not a slight to the 44th president. That's just the environment in which I was born and raised, and that experience struggle. But when I was running for office, my parents always taught me to be a change agent. And I was like, there's no better way to be a change agent than to be in the State House. And I was just, imagine this, just think about this, Joy. In front of the State House, you have the Confederate flag that flies proudly. Now inside the State House, you have the son of someone who was shot whose blood literally runs through the soil. He was shot by South Carolina state troopers in February of 1968. You have the agitator's son is now a legislator. I felt like there was no better way for me to create healing in my family, create change in the state that I loved, usher in a new future, than to actually be in those walls with those old men who looked at me and knew the history I represented. And it was very powerful for me. Was I successful in changing everything I wanted to change? I was not. But my 8 years there were a blessing for me, and I hope that many of my constituents thought the same. And I can guarantee you I'll be back to represent them one day again soon in some capacity.
Okay, yes, absolutely. I believe that. Let's talk about that Confederate flag. Let's zero in on that just a moment. I did cover the taking down of the Confederate flag, which apparently was not the first attempt to get it down. Nikki Haley gets a lot of credit for it. But when I was there, what I saw were black legislators, black state legislators maneuvering behind the scenes to make that happen. She took a lot of credit. Do you think that she's given too much credit for the flag coming down?
So I know Nikki very well. I sat next to Nikki for a number of years in the state capitol. Her desk was right next to mine. I think that it took a good bit of political courage to do that. I always tell people, though, if Jim DeMint was still there, there was no way Jim DeMint knew this was going to happen. But if Jim DeMint was the United States Senator and Nikki had not appointed Tim Scott to that position, that flag would still be there today. Jim DeMint was not bringing that flag down. But yeah, Nikki still had to look all of those white boys in the face and tell them, I'm taking this flag down. Either you're with me or you're not. I mean, she was still a very popular governor. But even she will tell you that even with any ounce of political courage she used, that flag came down for one reason and one reason alone. It was because of the blood of black men and women. It's one of the things I've realized, and one of the things I talk about in my Vanishing Country, is that every ounce of political change we've had, particularly in the South, comes because of the blood of black souls. And if we're going to get any change in this country, that's my fear, that it's going to take that. I was on with Don Lemon. Me and Don were crying as the flag came down in that July of 2015, almost 5 years ago. And I was for me, it was just so much. And my dad was in Hilton Head, and my dad was like, I was like, are you coming up? He said, no. He said, this is your moment. I want you to embrace this progress, but I also want you to temper it and know you still have yet a ways to go.
What do you want people to get out of this book? The J.D. Vance comparison has been made. I almost don't want to mention it, but that's the comparison that's being made, that this is a book that is an allegory of black life in the South, in a way that book. Yeah.
We don't get a chance to really tell our stories. I got turned down nearly 30 times for this book, not this particular book, but I wanted to write a political book like all our colleagues on TV. That's what they do. They go out and write political books. And I was like, I'm smart enough, let me write one.
Yeah.
And every publisher I went to said no. And Tracy Sherrod, a black woman, she stood with me and she gave me a chance to write this book. And it's been awesome. You asked me, what do I want? And by the way, I don't, the comparisons to J.D. Vance are fine. I pray to God this book sells as many as J.D. Vance.
We need to sell J.D. Vance numbers, people. Come on now. Y'all have a role in this.
Yeah, we do.
Yes.
But you ask me what I want. I want black folk to read it and get a sense of pride and get a sense of hope, understanding that my trauma may not be yours, but we can persevere together. That's first. And the second thing that I want is I want white people to read it, and I want white people to get a sense of understanding. Bishop Jakes told me one time, he said, you can teach people arithmetic, you can teach them English, you can teach them science, but you cannot teach them blackness. And I hope people pick up this book and get a sense of understanding of what it means to be black in this country. And with that understanding, begin to have a sense of compassion, have a sense of empathy, and begin to give black and brown children in particular the benefit of their humanity.
That's well said. Well said. Okay, now you said the words political book, so I'm tempted. What's going to happen in November? Because you've got, for the first time, I think, honestly, having followed politics since I was 12 years old and being very obsessed with it, this is the first election cycle where I feel like the Democratic Party will not be able to avoid the South, and that the South will be the center of the activity, the action. Because obviously you have an attempt to reelect the senator in Alabama, Doug Jones. You've got the race in Kentucky, where I'm sorry, I don't count out the ability of Mitch McConnell to lose that race. There is a Democrat in place as governor of Kentucky. You've got North Carolina, and you've got South Carolina. Jamie Harrison is running, and who I think a lot of people know as Jim Clyburn's former top guy as chief of staff. He's running. He's raising a lot of money. Am I crazy to think that this cycle, these southern states are viable? Georgia has 2 seats up, 2 Senate seats up.
Yeah,
are these seats viable?
They're very viable. When I ran in 2014, I always tell people that I feel like I chipped away at the glass. I got 42% of the vote against our current governor, Henry McMaster, when I ran for lieutenant governor. Then we have my friend Andrew and Stacey Abrams, who chipped away further at the glass. I'm ready for that glass to shatter.
Yep.
And so whether or not it's Reverend Warnock, whether or not it's Jamie Harrison, Doug Jones' reelection, Cal Cunningham in North Carolina. We can do this. The energy is there. Georgia's in play presidentially. Florida, definitely we need to win. You asked me about what's going to happen. I always preface everything with, I'm the same person who told you that Hillary Clinton was going to get 320, 330 electoral votes.
I thought you would too. I'm with you on that one. I was wrong with you. I was wrong right alongside you.
Just for the grain of salt. But we had the 2 most unpopular, and I think Hillary Clinton is wrongly vilified. History will look kindly upon her as one of the most transformative figures we've had in American politics. But I say all of that to say we had 2 of the most unpopular candidates for president ever in the history of this country. We won't have that in this election. And I've never seen in the history of this country where you have 100,000 Americans die during an election year. So I don't know how you recover from that, but at the end of the day, it's going to come down to white women, and so you probably need to have somebody else on your show to answer that question on why people voted like that.
And let's talk a little bit about COVID, because your book is a memoir, and to me it is also it is an American history. It is a Black American history. It is a memoir, but it's come out in the midst of a pandemic. And in your state, this is one of the states that did not expand the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, where rural, what I've read about the rural health systems there, it is tragic, particularly for the Black rural community. How will COVID wind up changing history, do you think?
I don't think COVID will change history for Black Americans. I think it reaffirms the history that we already know to be true. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I got into a very public spat with Jerome Adams, our Surgeon General, when he was basically telling Black folk to pull up their pants and they won't die from COVID. He was giving us the Bill Cosby pound cake speech. And for me, these systems of injustice, these systems of oppression that we've been yelling about for a very long period of time, the fact that we have food deserts, the fact that we have environmental injustice, educational injustice, economic injustice, which all lead to these preventable diseases, comorbidities, is the reason that we're dying at very high rates. And we've been telling you we've been suffering from these levels of oppression for a very long period of time. I outline it in my Vanishing Country. People ask, your book came out during a pandemic. I didn't plan that, trust me. We just tried to get it out before the 44th President of the United States book comes out later this fall. But I feel like my book is somewhat evergreen because it talks about these systemic injustices, and whether or not it was during a pandemic or 4 months later or 4 months earlier, we would still be talking about these systemic injustices, and we would still be talking about these lives that were cut short due to state violence. And so I think that COVID doesn't change much other than it takes away the little bit of wealth that people of color have been able to attain in this country. And it reaffirms what we already know to be true, that many of us are living under the thumb of oppression.
Indeed. The book is My Vanishing Country. It is by Bakari Sellers. And I repeat, this is one of the smartest young brothers that is out there that you are ever going to be able to get the chance to hear and see. Even though he's on the rival network, I still promote him when he's on. I will still tweet it out unashamedly because Bakari, I'm a fan.
I hope to have an opportunity and make do some cross programming and get people excited about a future show. So we'll see what happens.
Let me ask you the question that I do like to sometimes ask those who are on, even though they have books out. What are you reading? What do you like to read?
So the weird thing is I'm reading Don Winslow right now, and I'm really not a fiction reader, but he's like on my label. And so I get all of these books that are HarperCollins books, and Don Winslow's is six fiction stories. It's amazing. I'm reading Abdul El-Sayed. He ran against Gretchen Whitmer for governor. He got 32%, just an upstart. He's the former public health director for the city of Detroit. He wrote a book called Healing Politics, which is so dope. I am waiting for Tiffany Cross to send me a copy of her book.
Yes.
If she's watching this, when she watches this, I'm just going to the mailbox every day. I'm excited. And I just got done reading Hustle Hard, Hustle Smart by Curtis Jackson, AKA 50 Cent.
Yes, I love it. And what is the state that you, other than your own state, what's the state that you're gonna stay up late at night and watch on November 3rd? What's the state that you're gonna be like, this is the state that's gonna tell me how this is all gonna go?
Michigan. I mean, Michigan's gonna be kind of the state that tells us. I know that we've spent a lot of money in Arizona and doing some other things, but I think if you win Michigan, you can be president of the United States.
Yeah. And who do you think Biden will pick for his VP? Do you think he needs a black woman?
Oh, I think he needs Kamala Harris. I think he's going to either choose Amy Klobuchar or Kamala Harris, and I think that it's going to be I don't think what's happening in Minnesota is helping out Amy Klobuchar at all, but I think it's going to be a game time decision for him. Yeah. You know, I recall, and you may remember this, that everybody and their mama thought it was going to be Tim Kaine with Barack Obama, and then they came up with Joe Biden. So I kind of, this prognostication, we'll see what happens.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and brag on the fact that I picked Biden for Obama. I knew it from the very beginning that it would be Biden, because I'm like, what he needs is an old white guy like that. He needs a regular Joe, because he is named Barack Hussein Obama. So he needs the most regular Joe type of white dude that he can get, and that would be Joe Biden.
But Joe Biden's problem then is the same Joe Biden problem we have now, which you can never predict what Joe Biden's going to say. And so...
but that's part of his charm, is that he'll just say any damn thing. He don't care. He just says the things, Anyway.
He says all the things. All
the time. When you went, nope. So somebody said to me, I won't name who this person is, but it was hilarious. It's a black journalist that you and I both know, said that why he needs Kamala Harris is that Joe Biden needs the Michelle Obama to his George W. Bush. He needs somebody that slip him that hard candy. And just slip him that hard candy and just be like, you just take this. Well,
look, I believe in Michelle, but I don't know. I mean, he may surprise me and choose Val Demings or something like that. We'll see. It's going to be fun, though.
You never know. All right, the book is My Vanishing Country. Bakari Sellers is the author. This is a must-read book. You can pick it up right now. It is available for sale. And hopefully you all will support this young man, because we want him to write lots more books. As Tiffany Cross pointed out on What to Read, when you support these authors, support these black authors, they get to write more books. So buy this book. And more people
to write books, and more people that look like us get to write books. So amen to that.
That's absolutely right. All right. Well, I support you. We're out there trying to make sure we sell some books. All right. Bakari Sellers, thank you very much, my friend. Appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bakari Sellers, for being on What to Read. The book is My Vanishing Country. Everybody should read this book. I think that decades from now, people are going to look back on this. It's such an important American story, and I think it's going to be an absolute classic. So congratulations on the book, Bakari. And if you enjoyed this book, you're going to want to subscribe, because if you subscribe to the One Mic Network, you don't want to miss any of the great people that we've got coming up. We have so many great people coming up. David Korn, Michael Isikoff, Jill Winebanks, Maria Hinojosa, Michael Arsenault. We have so many people that we've interviewed that are going to be so amazing. You're going to want to hear them all. So make sure that you subscribe. Make sure that you share. Make sure that if you are downloading this as a podcast, you can get that anywhere you want. You can get that on Apple, iTunes, all the places where you get your podcasts. You can also listen to us that way. But just make sure that you don't miss any that are coming up. Thank you, Jason.
You're welcome, Joy. All
right. So thank you very much for that. Jason is our fearless producer of What to Read. And thank you all so much for being here. And we will see you on the next What to Read.
Bye, fam.
Bye.